Hello, this is another episode of National Divorce Talk Raw with your host, Marc Ruiz Evans. Well, let's get right into it. Recently, we saw an article from the Washington Post. It's not super recent, but it's within the last few months. We're going to be covering it today. We're going to be covering all the news that happens to deal with the topics of peaceful divorce, national divorce, and popular secession in America as covered by the news and not covered by the news, making sure that you get all the facts that you need that most of the mainstream media will never actually cover. We're going to get into this Washington Post article today. Secession might not seem like the lesser of two evils. It is also the less likely, by the Washington Post on December 31st, where they literally said, mainstream news, it would be preferable for there to be a bloody war with millions of people dead rather than a peaceful divorce. Yes, they actually said that in mainstream news. No one criticized them about that, and we will make sure that you are informed of the facts and what's actually going on. So I'm going to show you the article real quick, and then we're going to come back. So let's just do that. So here's the article. Secession might not seem like the lesser of two. Secession might seem like the lesser of two evils. It is also the less likely. At least it's not civil war, and other countries do it all the time. But breaking up the nation, the union, would be next to impossible here. By the Washington Post, by Stephen March, who wrote a recent book on the next civil war that was recently published, and this came out December 31st, 2021. So it's not super recent, but it's pretty recent. And what they're basically saying is it would be better to have a bloody civil war where people shoot each other and kill each other than to allow for a peaceful divorce. That's what they said. That's why we're covering this article. It's pretty extreme. The other article we might cover here is, I'm going to refresh the page. We are not facing the prospect of a second civil war, by the New York Times. That came out February 15, 2022. We'll be covering both of those today, but we're going to focus on the Washington Post article first. So I'm going to cover some of the major points the Washington Post article did, and then we're going to break down how what they did was not that accurate. Okay, so the first point they made is it's not that secession can't work. The rest of the world is busily all at it all of the time. Separatism is a global political trend. That's true. So the Washington Post is admitting that a lot of countries do peaceful secession and not peaceful secession all the time. There were half the countries there are today about 70 years ago. There's now 2 times as many countries as there were after World War II. That happened because of secession. So secession happens a lot. It happens all over the world. Everybody does it. A lot of times it's peaceful and it works. And there's many examples. At least Washington Post said that there is some allowance politically around the world for this trend. But here's their counterpoint. America's different. Classic American exceptionalism. And the United States might well be better off as separate countries. It might be healthier, more rational, less prone to violence. So they're saying national divorce would actually be better than what we have now. And it would be better to civil war. So that's the mainstream media saying seceding red and blue states would be better than what we have now and better than a civil war. That's the mainstream press saying that. Here's the Washington Post article where they literally admit that. But then here's the caveat, American exceptionalism. The main difference between American separatist movements and those in the rest of the world is that the countries that emerge from the separation could join the world quite comfortably. What they're talking about is that most of the states don't have the economic power or the finances to be able to provide a first world quality of living or the quality of living that they were familiar with as part of an American state. But here's the thing. In that same article, while they admit that that's true for most of the states, they literally say the quality of life in California would go up if it was a separate country. So they literally contradicted themselves in that same article. You can read the article. They say most states couldn't survive on their own independently. That's why the idea of separation, while plausible for the world, is not plausible here. And then they literally contradict themselves a few lines down saying, but, you know, Texas would do okay, and California, the standard of living would actually go up. That's directly contradicting themselves. Their point is true that for most states, you can't secede because you don't have the finances, and you would be immediately third world quality of life, especially in the South and the Midwest, immediately. That only proves that the discussion about national divorce is an easy discussion to have, because it does not mean the same thing as national dissolution. Some people have said that the topic of national divorce means the breakup of America. No, it doesn't. I have always said, most states cannot afford to be independent or their own unit. Period. End of story. Said that for years, since 2012. So I've never said anything different. And when we look at it, here's the Washington Post backing up the point I've made for over a decade. Most states simply can't do it. So when we're looking at national divorce, we're really only talking about a few states and not all of them, which means the discussion of national divorce does not mean the same thing as national dissolution. It simply is implausible for it to work that way. I see there's comments. I'm going to get to them after I make a few more points. Here's another counterpoint they made. But both the Texas and California separatists have their arguments about why separation is constitutional, drawn from esoteric readings of Texas versus White, an 1869 Supreme Court decision. Now, here's what they totally forgot to mention in that article. Texas versus White came after the Civil War. So under American law, you go over the most current precedent, not the oldest one, which is why when we look at slavery, we look at the laws that say it is illegal. We don't go back to the Dred Scott decision and say, oh, it's legal. So you had decisions by the Supreme Court saying slavery is legal. Then as time went on and closer to our time now, you had the Supreme Court and the American legal system say slavery is illegal. We don't skip this and go right back to the earlier legislation that said the total opposite. So nobody walks around saying slavery is legal because the Supreme Court said it was at one time. Nobody does that because our legal system doesn't work that way. It's based upon the most current prescient argument, which means Texas versus White when we're talking about secession, because it came after the Civil War, which means it's more relevant than the Civil War under the way the American legal system works. And it is the only legal decision about secession. So you have to look at it because there is nothing else to look at. Cornell Law School says when a court faces a legal argument, if a previous court has ruled on the same or a closely related issue, then the court will make their decision in alignment with the previous. That's called the principle of Starry Decisis. It's completely different than common law. So a lot of European countries have common law, meaning these laws have been locked in the books forever. You have to follow them that. In America and in a few other countries, you have what's called Starry Decisis, which means if you're a court and you're making a decision, it has to be roughly in line with what courts before you have made, unless you're reversing that decision. And the idea is that the laws across America should align. So you shouldn't be able to say something is illegal in Nevada and legal in California if it's the exact same thing. The reason that you're not able to do that is that you have to go off precedent. Was there a higher court than you making a decision before this? If there was, you have to follow that decision. The only people who can buck decisions definitively is the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has also never heard on the topic of secession. So this is a point. When I see lawyers go, this is an esoteric decision. We don't need to follow something that was made so long ago. Based on what? I mean, what's that based upon? The American legal system always follows old decisions if they were the most relevant and the most current and related to this topic. We just prosecuted Somali pirates on a law in the books that's 100 years old. No one said anything. When they wanted to prosecute Somali pirates, nobody said, well, that piracy law is really esoteric, so we shouldn't use it. They just used it and no one complained, and the whole thing went right through the legal system. That was a few years ago. So piracy laws and slavery laws still apply, but secession laws don't? How's that work? Again, all of this was completely omitted by this article, and that's the point. Here's the article again trying to slam down the idea of secession. Justice Antonin Scalia wrote in 2006, to begin with, the answer is clear. If there was any constitutional issue resolved by the Civil War, is that there's no legal right to secede. So here's how he's wrong. In America, wars don't decide decisions. And in fact, under international law, they never have. You have to have an armistice or a treaty. So here we go. Before the Civil War, the Revolutionary War with England did not end until America and England signed what's known as the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris, not the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, is the document that actually made America because it gave them international recognition. You can look it up. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all that stuff you were told about did not make America America. The Treaty of Paris did, where the French, the English, and the Americans all signed a document saying we recognize America as a legal sovereign nation. That was what made America America. It wasn't that they beat them in Cornwallis at a big battle. It wasn't that they chased all the British out. It was that they signed a legal document under international law saying they received international recognition. This also happened after the Civil War. Nobody said that because we bombed Japan to smithereens that the war was over. They actually had to have someone come across onto an American battleship who represented the Empire of Japan and sign that document. And it wasn't until that was signed, it's very famous, it's in black and white, the war was over. So we have a precedent of America saying, just because we won a war doesn't mean the war's over until you sign a document before the Civil War. And we have one after the Civil War. But we're supposed to believe that with the Civil War, that was different and unique, and somehow it doesn't matter when they followed this precedent before and after at major wars. So the precedent applies to America that you have to sign a treaty making America, but that same precedent doesn't apply to the Civil War. And America won World War II when it signed documents ending the war with those countries, but we didn't really need to do that because you didn't really need to do that with the Civil War. No one says that. So it's great they got Justice Antonin Scalia acting like that, but Scalia in his comment never admitted Texas versus White existed. Bad. Never admitted the principle of Starry Decisis. Bad. And never admitted that all previous wars had to have a treaty or declaration signed for them to end. And just to be clear, the Appomattox Courthouse document signed by the two warring generals was a cessation of hostilities. It was not a treaty of peace. You can look it all up. The other thing this article forgot to mention is that Salmon Chase is also a Supreme Court justice. And he was appointed by Abraham Lincoln, who launched the Civil War. And Salmon Chase disagrees and says, no, you have to have a legal decision in order to state that it's not okay. That's because Salmon Chase wrote the decision in Texas versus White because he knew a war didn't settle the legal issue, a treaty does. So that's great. They have the media always wheels out Antonin Scalia and says, here's the Supreme Court justice. And he looked at it and says, there's nothing to this, a war settled it. But I have another Supreme Court justice who was appointed by Lincoln, who fought the Civil War, who directly disagrees with Antonin Scalia. So which Supreme Court justice are we supposed to believe? The one appointed by Lincoln or the one not appointed by Lincoln? The one who seems to understand that America was formed by the Treaty of Paris and not by the Revolutionary War, or the one who doesn't seem to understand that? Hey, I got a Supreme Court justice saying X. I got a Supreme Court justice saying Y. Who's right? Exactly. And Salmon Chase was there during the Civil War, and he was appointed by Lincoln, and he did support the Civil War, but he didn't conclude, oh, we need to say nothing about this at all, and it's totally cool. Never happened. Why was he compelled to make the statement that you can secede with consent of the states in Texas versus White? He didn't even have to bring it up. That's partly why they call it esoteric, because Texas versus White wasn't directly about secession. It was about bonds. But the top Supreme Court justice appointed by Lincoln, who lived through the Civil War, said we got to put a statement in there talking about the legality of secession. Why did he do that? Because he was just crazy? Because he didn't understand the legal system? Or because he did understand the legal system? Not mentioned at all in this article by the Washington Post. That's key. All right. They do admit in the Washington Post article that the separatists respond with the obvious facts. Scalia admits technically the constitutionality of secession has never been tested in the Supreme Court. That's true. So there's only one ruling on secession ever, and it was Texas versus White. And the Supreme Court and no legal body has actually re-examined that issue since that time. So you can't say what it means. That's why we have a court. So in England and Australia and other common law countries, they will have a top professor of law look at their laws and say, if we look at these common laws, this is probably what the law means. And judges will base their decisions on what a law professor says. That's not what happens in America. It doesn't matter if you get every single law professor in America to say X equals apples. It doesn't matter till a court, and the top court says it is, that's the law. That's how things work here. So that's great. They got a person saying this, doesn't mean anything until the top court rules on it. By the way, they've never even discussed this decision since Texas versus White was created. Moving on. Now, the article says another reason states can't secede is that even if you could do Texas versus White, and even if you could get the other states to approve, as they say there, if they think an application is serious enough, which they do by asking the other states, that's a reference to Texas versus White, which said you can secede through quotes consent of the states. I don't know why my words aren't with me today. Then it goes to the Security Council of the UN. That is what we've been saying here at the Cal-Exit movement. So first, you do a referendum in California showing that a majority of the people want to secede. Brexit passed with 52%. Just saying. That's now the international legal precedent, and it's current. So technically, by international legal precedent, we wouldn't need anything more than 52% of the California voters, not even the population, to back secession for it to qualify the international legal standard as saying Californians want this. We would then go to the federal government and ask a majority of the states for consent, which Washington Post is at least admitting. And then we'd have to go to the UN and ask for international recognition. I agree with all that. That's all true. We have to have a referendum showing Californians want this first. Then you have to get a majority of the states to approve it so that America approves it. And then you would go to the UN to get international recognition, which would serve the same premise as the Treaty of Paris, making California an actual nation. Here's where I disagree. So the Washington Post says, so the United States, if it wanted to, could easily hold up any state asking for sovereignty. It would have the Security Council seat and would have the home state veto. There's a lot of garbage with that statement and just inaccurate understandings and garbage produced by Washington Post. So Russia, China, France, England, America sit on the Security Council, not just America. The Security Council has to vote unanimously or at least a majority in order to pass things. America is not the only signatory. They somehow completely forgot to mention that in the article. We have a situation where Russia recognizes a country, South Ossetia, and America recognizes a country, Kosovo, but nobody else does. Just because the Security Council did not back South Ossetia and Kosovo from acting like separate nations doesn't mean those two countries don't act like separate nations today. So Kosovo wildly acts like a separate nation. Everyone in the world hates it, basically, even the Germans, and especially the Czech Republic former states. But America still backs it. So it doesn't matter because America's powerful and says, I don't care. Russia did the same thing with South Ossetia. I don't care. You don't recognize it? I don't care. I recognize it. It's a country in a story. That's the way things work today, folks. You may not like it, but that's hard reality. And for America to say, well, we can unilaterally invent countries that are not following international legal precedent for over the last century, and it's cool, but you can't, that's never going to hold up in court. When America backed Kosovo, and it said it was doing it to prevent genocide, maybe that's true. What a great cause. That's not how the international law and the international world works. So they're quoting America's violating this principle of you got to go to the Security Council and get approval in order to get recognition by a nation themselves with their continued support of Kosovo. So America's basically said with their actions, we don't care what international law is. I do what I want, and that's what happens. Okay, well, that means China, Russia, France, England could do the same thing. Russia's already doing that. China might do that too. France has a little bit of this with New Caledonia, where they recognize New Caledonia as a colony, but the rest of the world is pushing it for it to be something else. England has a little bit of this with Gibraltar and Spain. So almost all these countries have regions that are seen as not independent or independent from that host nation. And those host nations say, I don't care, I do what I want. And that's basically the way that it goes. If you're not sure about that, I would ask you to read the book by California University professor Bridget Coggins. Professor Bridget Coggins is the foremost expert on international recognition. And in her recent book, she literally says what I just told you. Might makes right. Big countries don't care what international law is, even though there's lots of international laws and precedent clearly documented. They just do whatever the hell they feel like. And that's the way that it actually works. Professor Bridget Coggins, foremost expert on the subject, says that's the way that it is. So what happens if China and Russia like a decision for California to leave, but America and England don't? And France is completely silent. California has already achieved quasi-diplomatic recognition from Russia, a Security Council member. NBC or ABC News said that in 2016, when there was the mock, not real diplomatic agency, diplomatic post by a fake independent California in Moscow. The NBC or ABC or CBS, one of them said, California basically has recognition as an independent country from a Security Council member if it already wants it. So that's already happened. No, it's not official, but it was in the eye of public opinion. Additionally, what if Russia and China don't agree with America? What if France doesn't agree with America? France is not exactly friendly with America all the time. The other thing they forgot to mention was there's no such thing as a home state veto. Doesn't exist. No one cared what Sudan thought when they created South Sudan. No one cared what Indonesia thought when they created East Timor. No one cared what the Serbians thought about Croatia. And no one cared what Saddam thought in Iraq when they created Kurdistan. That's 4 examples where they just didn't care what the host nation said. They went ahead and did it anyways. So no, that's not a real precedent. Wow, did they get that wrong? The other thing that they completely forgot to mention was, and really they should have got this, because in the article they talk about Texas versus White, and if you ask the states for permission, theoretically you could leave and then you'd go to the Security Council. So they're already admitting Texas versus White exists. They're already admitting the process of asking states asking states for admission exists. And then they're saying, but what if America says, we don't want you to leave? Why would that happen? So under Texas versus White, you have to get a majority of states to say that it's okay to secede. That's democracy. So what they're saying is, yes, Texas versus White exists. Yes, you have to get consent to the states to do it. But even if you did it, America may object to you leaving. Why? A majority of states, a majority of America said it's okay to leave, but then America goes against what Americans said and opposes them? How does that happen? So a majority of states say we want X, and then America says, actually, even though a majority of us said we want X, we're really going to argue for Y. What? That doesn't make any logical sense at all. That's the second time this article directly contradicted itself. So when you get a majority of the states to approve, yes, America would not stand in the way because America already said they're cool with it. That's how it works. So you should have noticed that by now this article has already contradicted itself twice, while trying to back up the point that it would be better to have a bloody civil war than a peaceful national divorce. Moving on. Here's the other argument they make. A separate Texas wouldn't have the power of the current United States in global negotiations. It would just be another mid-sized country with no history and no connections. The rest of the world would give it as much attention to an oppressed Texas as it gave to Xinjiang in 2009, i.e. none. So Xinjiang is the Uyghur Muslim province of China, where they're really not Chinese. They're more of a Turkic ethnic group with some loose Chinese cultural affiliation, but they're very Muslim and they're more Turkic culturally and genetically, and not Han Chinese. And they live there, and they said, we should be able to be independent, and everybody ignored their applies for freedom. Here's the thing that, again, this article completely forgot to mention. Nations are successful financially if they are economically linked to the world. Xinjiang and Ukraine were not economically connected to the rest of the modern world, which is why Russia and China get to do whatever they want with them. Texas is massively connected to the entire global economy, especially with oil and then also with technology, and it has international students at its universities. Nothing like that exists in the Ukraine or Xinjiang at all. Secondly, California has forced America to do every single international trade deal that America has done since the 1930s. I'm not exaggerating. Professor Abraham Lowenthal in 2009 in the book Global California, Rising to the Cosmopolitan Challenge, pointed out that All of America's international trade deals and international trade linkages since the 1930s, or basically the last full century, were because of Californians, on the behest of Californians, and largely drafted by California brains. The other thing is, they forgot to mention that California is the entertainment, technology, and internet hub of the world, and you could even say university hub of the world. So everybody knows about movies coming from here, Disneyland, parks, tourism here, California wine. Everybody knows the technology industry got started here, laptops, smartphones. Everybody knows the internet got started here. That's true. And you could just cut off the world economy from California and no one would notice. They wouldn't notice the top universities being cut off. They wouldn't notice the internet being cut off. They wouldn't notice technology being cut off. They wouldn't notice entertainment being cut off, because California is as internationally connected as Xinjiang and Ukraine. That's just dumb. That's a stupid statement to make based upon complete ignorance. California is massively connected, and California alone is the reason that America is connected. So if California left, it would be just fine, because it would have tons of international connections, completely opposite from what Washington Post was insinuating. Okay, here's another point they make. You can't secede because uncertainty over small questions of daily life like pensions and passports is a major reason Scotland and Quebec are not independent nations today. Here's my response. That is a complete lie. That is a total, complete garbage lie. Scotland and Quebec are not independent today, not because they were squeamish about solving difficult issues. That's not what happened. In fact, I would encourage you to ask the Scots why they barely lost the vote for full independence. The British government lied to them about staying, what would happen if they stayed, lowered the voting age to 16, and inserted a pro-English school curriculum. That took me about 5 seconds to find. Scottish independence campaigner claims MI5, that's their secret service, is leading a dirty tricks campaign up to the Scottish independence referendum. That was posted by The Independent by reporter Jonathan Brown on Saturday, 14th June 2014. So it was not hard for me to find references that the Scots felt the British played dirty tricks in order to trick the Scottish into not following the law, into not voting for independence. It was not because the Scots felt confused about the myriad of discussions. It was because they lowered the voting age, got the youth in there, brainwashed the youth, played other dirty tricks, and a whole lot of mischief, and barely won. That is not the same thing as the Scottish people saying, wow, this is so complicated, let's back away from it. Ask the Scots. Again, why did the Washington Post print an article that took me about 5 seconds to poke through? I found this article in 5 seconds. Interesting. I guess they don't have the internet. Quebec didn't leave because they got a very good deal becoming essentially independent. So this is from last year. Quebec wants to declare itself a nation, and Canada's politicians don't mind. Quebec did not leave because Quebec basically got everything short of full sovereignty that it wanted when it tried its independent referendum in the 1990s. They got 8 out of 10 things they wanted. And if they push for the full 10, the whole thing might have fallen apart. So they go, we'll take 80% of what we want. That's cool. That is not this. The Quebecois did not leave because they were afraid negotiations would be complicated. They felt they got a really good deal and didn't need to leave anyways. The Scots did not leave because they felt the negotiations were complicated. They got tricked. It takes about 5 seconds to find this online, yet somehow the Washington Post could print garbage and lies, which are easily disproven, and just leave it up there. But let's take on the argument that perhaps negotiations would be very complicated for an independent California to pursue. Perhaps, makes sense. But California figured out how to create climate change legislation for the entire world population to adopt all by itself between 2005 and 2014. And they did such a good job that the UN, President Ban Ki-moon, insisted California continue to lead. So climate change is one of the most complex issues the world has ever faced, and the United Nations is the global discussion forum. California on its own, not with the federal government, not with the UN, not with NATO, not with any other country involved, all by itself, invented an entire legal regime for the entire planet to adopt on the most complex issue the world has faced. And they did such a good job that every other world discussion organization said, wow, you should continue the discussion. So we could figure out climate change legislation to the point that the entire rest of the world could follow it when they were too scared to do that on their own because they were afraid of the complexity. But we can't figure out the complexity of secession. How's that follow? The rest of the planet said, you're the best at negotiating the most intractable issue we face this century, but you can't face this other issue? Does that make sense? Secession would be too tough a negotiation for California versus developing a law the entire rest of the world was too scared to tackle. That doesn't make sense. Here's the reference where the UN asked California to continue the leading. Here's the quote. After last year's successful Governors Global Climate Summit, the United Nations asked California to host another summit focused on the great work of cities, states, and regions, which already happened. So there it is. Again, that's been known. Somehow that was not mentioned at all in this article. The other thing is that there's only one study on peaceful secession movements. Here it is by Robert Young. How do peaceful secession movements happen? Political Economy Research Group, Papers in Political Economy, 58, London, Ontario, Department of Economics, University of Western Ontario, 1994. One academic article on peaceful secession movements where you ask permission to leave and you hold votes and you go through the process, not violence. Here's what they said. Negotiations are fast. Page 2, page 13. Negotiations about secession are not protracted. When a unit breaks up peacefully, the two sides disengage quickly. They said studying peaceful secession movements, which is what California is pursuing, and this is the only academic article of its kind, takes about 5 years. Somehow, this article couldn't mention that, there's only one Supreme Court case on secession, and they couldn't mention there's only one study on secession, and they both say, yes, you could secede through consent of the states, and that if you do it peacefully, it'll take about 5 years max. That's not intractable. These are hard sources. I don't know why they couldn't bring this up. Now, here's part 2. There's another article out right now called We Are Not Facing the Prospect of a Second Civil War by the New York Times, February 15th, 2022. Going to throw out a few quotes for you. Worried about a second civil war, the question to ask isn't whether people hate each other, but whether they hate the results from the irreconcilable social and economic interests of opposing groups. I'm not sure there's anything in American society right now that plays the same role that conflict over slavery did. There is, however, a serious problem with this narrative. The Civil War we fought in the 19th centuries was not sparked by division qua division. So I'll show you that article right now. Let me reload that. There you go. By the New York Times, I'll reload that again. We are not facing the prospect of a second civil war, February 15th, 2022. So there it is. What they're largely saying is people didn't like slavery way before the Civil War. The South did not like the North way before the Civil War. I mean, there was people talking about how bad the Northerners were and that they were full of immigrants and they didn't like it in the South for decades. And the Northerners were talking about the backwards Southerners who married their sisters and their plantations for decades. The article is making a good point. There were already divisions in America about slavery and how horrible it was or not horrible it was. And there were already regional divisions between the North and South that went on for decades. That didn't result in the Civil War. I mean, this divisions between each other went on for about 30 years before there was actual shooting at each other. And what they're saying, it wasn't until the system of slavery was actually going to be economically shut down, as the Southerners feared under the election of President Lincoln and his newly formed Republican Party, that the war happened. There's a good point there. So there was a lot of hate against the North and the South. There was a lot of differences of opinions about slavery between the North and the South, but you never actually had real war until the South said, oh my God, this guy's actually going to shut down slavery for real, and we won't have an economy anymore. That's a good argument. I will have a counterpoint to that soon. I already have one working up right now, but I wanted to let it sit there for a second. This will be the second show we'll do. on why this isn't a relevant argument for us now, and why California is already losing money, and why the red states already feel that they are in an economic calamity due to the blue states. We'll get into that next time. If you want to offer opinions, please do. But I did want to point out that here's the New York Times having to say, we're not going to face the prospect of a second civil war. And if you read that article, they're talking about how a lot of people are talking about a civil war, and how there's multiple polls out showing people think there's going to be a civil war. So the article ends with saying we're not going to really have a civil war because we're still economically tied to each other. There isn't enough reason to believe that there will be economic calamity if one group leaves from the other. But 3/4 of that article to get to that point is poll saying Americans worry about civil war, poll saying Americans worry about civil war, poll saying Americans worry about civil war. So there's the New York Times saying that this week. And I like to juxtapose that with this article by the Washington Post right before the end of last year saying, secession might be less bloody and more peaceful, but we can't do it. It'd be better to have a bloody civil war and kill each other than actually have peaceful secession. That's the Washington Post. No one contradicted them on that. That's December. Then we go January, February, 3 months later, and here we are with the New York Times, another major DC area publication saying, we're not really headed for a civil war, but then citing a bunch of facts about how there's a civil war. I'm going to get into why this argument is wrong next time. But I just wanted to point out that two major sources talking about the prospect of the civil war and saying, it's probably not going to happen for an esoteric reason, and it would be better that we shoot each other in the face than let a peaceful divorce happen. That is the conclusion of National Divorce Talk Raw with your host, Marc Ruiz Evans. Thank you for being here. As always, appreciate it. Let's take a look at the comments. If the comments are relevant, I will cover them. If they are not, I will not. Yes, here we go. All Jason Wright. Yeah, imagine if we had regained our independence from, that's true. That's why their law dictates treaties take precedent. That's right. Jason, good point. Excellent legal point, Jason. The law dictates that treaties take precedent over even all domestic documents. So when the president signs a treaty with a foreign country, that supersedes every law in America and every Supreme Court decision. That's been held up. So the president has to have the ability to sign treaties with countries, and whatever agreement they make, if it contradicts the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or any Supreme Court decision, it doesn't matter. It's automatically held as supreme. So treaties are the law of the land, and they beat everything else like a card game. Under the UN Entrance Treaty, the fundamental human right of self-determination is something the USA has already agreed to uphold and respect. That's true, which means that America should recognize Texas versus White. And if we did get consent to the states, they should allow us to go to the UN Security Council because they already signed a treaty with the UN. So when America joined the UN, it signed a treaty. When America joined the UN, it signed a treaty. That means it signed an agreement that supersedes all domestic law. That agreement America signed says that it recognizes the right of self-determination of other nations. So America would have to violate its treaty law, which it can't, in order to say, we signed this agreement with the UN, but we don't really recognize it. We're going to violate all our understanding of treaties for the last 250 years, just so California can't secede. All right. Nathan Eddy, what do you do? I cover secession topics. El Scorpio Perfecto, when will Cal-Ex have big rallies and where will it be held? They're really punching down on us right now, holding events out here. What do I think about the upcoming convention the states, red states, are talking about? The convention of the states is an interesting topic. If they allowed states the right to secede, which they already have, but in a more clear-cut manner, I would be for that. The problem with the convention of the states is that there's no law saying that if you hold that convention of the states, that you can only talk about one issue. So when you look at the convention of the states, people are saying, I'm from Alabama, I'm from Texas, let's have a convention of the states, and we're only going to discuss one issue, that you can't have abortion or something. That's not how it works. Once you hold a convention of the states, everything in the Constitution is open book. So you could literally rewrite everything, and these statements by politicians saying, I'm only going to discuss one thing, are not legally binding. So you hold that convention, you can rewrite every single law on anything that you want, period, and there's nothing legally to stop it. And there is no way to hold politicians to their verbal or written promises that they're not going to do that at the convention. Frankly put, somebody could just straight up lie to you. The governor of Texas could say, I will only look at laws relating to puppies at a convention of the states, completely lie to you, write the thing on everything he wants rewritten across the board, and you could do absolutely nothing about it at all. That's the law with convention of the states. So you open that up, it's literally Pandora's box. There is some benefit in that they could make it more clear that you could leave, but I would rather just go with the Texas versus White decision because, as I explained, there's enough legal precedent there to say blah, 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 that we could do this on our own. Go to CalX at Home on Twitter. El Scorpio Perfecto, both Texas and California independent movements, though, are pretty big. They need more independence demonstrations to be more visible. True. And New Hampshire Independence is hosting one very soon to do just that. We're under lockdown. I mean, we used to do conventions and meetings all the time before COVID, and then things are so strict and ridiculous out here, it's almost impossible. Gun restrictions go back in California. I think you mean gun restrictions would go back in California, and yes, we're totally fine with that. So I apologize. Somebody wants to do something right when I'm doing this. If we separated, California's crazy gun laws would stay in California, and you wouldn't have to worry about them becoming federalized. Like the machine gun capacity ban started in California, was pushed on America. A lot of conservative states like their guns, and they don't want California gun laws. The only way to be free from California gun laws is for California to not be part of America. So conservatives, you know how California is. We're always going to be pushing for more extreme gun laws. The only way that that's not going to happen and go into your neighborhood is if you cut us off. So gun restrictions would go back to California, but only if California was allowed to secede. And if it did, and if it doesn't, California is going to continue to push its onerous laws on the rest of you. That's going to happen. Nathan Eddy, allow the states to have their own immigration and foreign policy so the USA could be more like the EU. I'm not arguing for the other states, but I definitely think California could do that. Governor Newsom went on Spanish television in a foreign country in Latin America and said, consider us as having a separate foreign policy. Governor Newsom said that when he took over. Consider us having a separate foreign policy on immigration on Spanish TV in a Spanish-speaking foreign country. Jerry Brown told the government of China, when it comes to climate change, consider us a separate country. So we already have governors literally telling foreign countries, consider us a separate nation on key policy differences. Devil War, I wish California an independent country right now. So do we. Jason Wright, as the new head of CalExit, I'm hoping we can get the majority of states to all fly the California flag on the same day, say July 4th. El Scorpio Perfecto, who will leave first, Texas or California, or will you plan to leave in the same time frame? The movements are separate. So while there's a lot of connection between Californians and Texans that we both have the legal right to peacefully secede, you know, Texas is a different culture. My family is Tejano. They left from Texas. I sometimes go back. Texans have a very radically different culture than than California. And just because we're crawling with Mexicans does not mean that we're like California Mexicans don't act, think, talk, or vote like Texas Mexicans. I understand that to a lot of Democrats, that seems crazy, but that's the way that it is. It turns out whether you're Latin or white or black or Asian, you kind of reflect the political opinions of the area you grow up in. I don't have any common opinions politically with my cousins in Texas because I'm from here. My mom and my tias who left Texas also do not share, think, act, vote, talk, walk, drink the same way as their cousins who stayed in Texas 30 years ago. Radically different cultures. So we're cool with each other, but I wouldn't say we're doing anything in tandem or parallel. Nathan Eddy, I sort of want Texas to have an embassy in Taipei, even though I'm Californian. There's no competition here. So what we've talked about with the New Hampshire independence movement and the Texas independence movement is that normative creation of this idea is a win for all of us. When it becomes okay to talk about secession and you're not automatically assumed as get your guns and I'm going to shoot my way out. But people go, oh, you're a rational person who wants to follow the legal system. We all win. If Texas secedes peacefully, California is more likely to secede. If California secedes peacefully, Texas is more likely to secede. So every win for Texas is a win for California and vice versa, because it makes the idea normal, routine, not scary. So you can want Texas to have an embassy in Taipei in every country and hope Texas becomes independent first. All that's going to do is help California, because it will show the rest of America that, yes, you can secede and it's not the end of the world and you can do it peacefully. So we don't have much alignment politically, and we don't necessarily plan co-events, but spiritually we are aligned with the Texas movement, and there's no competition. We hope them the best. No mote re. I don't know what that means. Probably Latin. Okay, well, Texas and California are basically their own thing, Nathan. That's true. No Republic of Rick shenanigans, though. I don't know what that means. I want a California Cultural Center in Texas and a Texas Cultural Center in California. That would be a good idea, because it would already show that these states can act like nations. So when California had the mock embassy in Moscow, Russia, it wasn't real. It didn't have any of the same functions. It couldn't, and we admitted that. But boy, did it put the idea in people's heads. And so if there was a Texas embassy in California and a California embassy in Texas, it would put the idea in people's heads, even though it's not legally binding. Again, winning is by normalizing this conversation. Winning is by making it seem that rational people can engage in this discussion. Texas does it first, great. If California does it first, great. Doesn't matter. We all win. Where is means California their own Independence Day? So California doesn't necessarily have an Independence Day. California was independent from Mexico and America for 10 years, just like Texas. I want to repeat that. 1836 to 1846. California was independent from Mexico and America, just like Texas, for a full 10 years. Texas goes on and on about how they were independent from Mexico and America for 10 years. That was because they applied to be part of America and were rejected. So a lot of Texas independence goes, our fabled time of when we were independent for 10 years. Yeah, because you applied to join America and they rejected you. That's the only reason you were independent. So they don't bring that up. In California, we never applied to join America or Mexico. We kicked out the governors from 1836 to 1846 and we're fully independent. So our quest for independence in California is actually more legitimate than the Texas one, because we never actually tried to join anybody and were independent by de facto of the fact that we were rejected. That's why Texas was independent, because their application to join was rejected. We never did that. We were quite content being independent, and for 10 years. Now, we don't have an Independence Day. Here we should, and that's largely because we still do not teach the accurate history of California to schools. So if you talk to any school child, if you look at the curriculum all the way up to college, they completely cut out that there was a military invasion, Latinos were gunned down, an apartheid state was put in, genocide happened right away, the American government was egregious, they made sure that all brown people couldn't vote, they gunned down brown people. It was a horrible Nazi-style regime with dictatorial power. No one knows that, and they don't teach that in college. Yeah, California is so progressive and so about acknowledging the truth. We can't even admit to our school children or college kids about how we actually became a state. Hashtag Texit, hashtag CalExit. El Scorpio Perfecto. What is your opinion that a secession of USA states is basically just blue USA and red USA? For me, it's so basic and they don't do the research. Well, as I explained in the show, individual states can't really leave. So 45, 48 states would be as poor as a Central African Republic if they try to go on their own way. Now, if you're talking about a giant collection of states, say 30 blue states and 30 red states, or 25, that would be different. But if we're talking about every red state goes its own way and every blue state goes its own way, that's not going to work. Texas could survive as a red state. California could survive as a blue state. And Manhattan, New York could survive as a blue state. Every other place in America doesn't have what it takes to go on its own. If you're talking about large confederations like in the 1860s, perhaps, but that's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing individual states talk about how they want independence. Take a look at New Hampshire, which actually filed paperwork for independence. Texas, which actually got paperwork for independence through their political system in California, where we filed secession referendums 5 times. I think Alaska also did something. But outside of those people that have actually filed paperwork, that's about 4 states. Republic of Rick is about the tea. I don't know what that means. I personally love the Rick and Morty show. Great. Republic of Rick is a great indie movie about how not to be an independent movement. Okay, thank you. Hashtag CalTexit. That's cute. Very cute. Okay, thank you all for joining. I hope you found today's show informative. I got another one coming up on even more facts. We will always discuss the information. Make sure you're getting the correct information because the media simply won't do this. And you can find it always here at National Divorce Talk Raw with your host, Marc Ruiz Evans. Adios, abuela.